All right, hey, welcome to the Davis Oddfellows Lodge. My name is Larry Gunther. I am part of the Davis Oddfellows Lodge. I will do a little housekeeping. If you need the restroom, they're out the door and to your right. I want to thank everybody for coming down tonight. If you're wondering what Oddfellows is, it is a fraternal organization. You've probably seen the 3 links around all over California and the rest of the U.S. Those 3 links are friendship, love, and truth. The mission of the Oddfellows is to elevate human character through friendship, love, and truth. And there are several different degrees. The highest degree is universal justice. So in Davis, at the Davis Lodge, we like to live our values. And so we are trying to promote universal justice and elevate human character through friendship, love, and truth. So here we are. And this is our inaugural Universal Justice Speaker Series. And I would like you all to give a warm welcome to our speaker, Natalie Dillon, who is going to speak on universal justice and child support, ensuring equity for families.
Thank you, Larry. Really appreciate it. So I'm hoping today we can have more of a conversation. So I've got some slides, I've got some information, but please feel free to ask questions and interject as we go. I'm going to kind of tell the story of child support, and I'm going to start giving some historical context and perspective of kind of where the program started and how it's evolved over the last 50 years, 50 plus years. And before I dive in, I should mention, and I'll explain a little bit more about this. So again, my name is Natalie Dillon, and I'm the director of the Colusa, Sutter, Yoho Regional Child Support Agency. So it's an agency that represents the jurisdiction of those 3 counties. They used to be 3 separate departments and then regionalized into one agency, and I'll explain a little bit more about precisely what we do in a few slides from here. But I'm going to start by telling you where we started. So the history of the child support program. I'm going to talk about some of the legislative changes and some of the policy updates. And I think one of the things that I think is really cool about this presentation and this organization is the program has truly evolved through legislative policy change to try to achieve universal justice and to try to achieve equity for families. And so I'll talk about what that journey has looked like. I'm going to talk a little bit about local child support, so my agency and what we provide here in Yoho County. And I'm going to talk about some of the modernization and efforts to, again, increase access to services. And then hopefully we'll have a discussion and conversation as we go. So again, please feel free to interject and ask questions. All right. So just from a perspective of history, I want to start by just making reference to kind of the 1930s and 1950s. So this is a time where we had, and we've all heard in history and over time, we had the stock market crash, we had the Great Depression. And because of the economic impacts of that era and those times, we had the creation of AFDC, the Aid to Families with Dependent Children, which was a welfare program. Its original name was actually ADC, Aid to Dependent Children, and then it evolved to AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children. Then we had the FDIC, we had the New Deal, World War II. So the world, or America in particular, was really truly in a state of turmoil. And the rate of public assistance or welfare was really increasing because there was significant poverty, there weren't jobs, again with the Great Depression, the impact from the war. When the war started, it actually created new jobs, but you still had, and those were often more in the urban centers, you still had tremendous poverty throughout the area. So we've got AFDC ticking along, we've got other social services happening, and I'll talk some more about some other major milestones. In 1971, there was a report written by Trudy Forche. She issued this report through the RAND Institute. What I think is particularly interesting about this report, she happened to be Elvis' secretary, and she was married, and she had children, and she ended up separating from her husband, and child support became something that she became very passionate about, and she became a prolific and great researcher on the topic of child support. She wrote a report that was issued by RAND in 1971. And the title of that report was Non-Support of Legitimate Children by Affluent Fathers as a Cause of Poverty and Welfare Dependence. And what we had seen during that era is more and more absent parent households. And many times fathers would leave to find work and may not make it back. There was a whole lot of different dynamics happening. But what she was specifically focused on were affluent fathers who were leaving mothers and children behind. And so that's all documented in this RAND report. Meanwhile, around this same era, you have Congressman Gerald Ford. Now, Ford was a congressman in the state of Michigan. He was a Michigan congressman for over 25 years. When he was born, he was actually born under the name of Leslie King. His father left his mother and essentially abandoned them. He left and went, he evaded child support, didn't pay in support, and he left and went to other states in order to avoid supporting his child. So Leslie King ended up being adopted by his father, Gerald Ford Sr., who then gave him his name, Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford Sr. Not only gave him his name, but raised him as his own child. He became a successful politician, became a congressman, but that was a really influential part of who he was and how it framed him, and it framed his perspective on family and framed his perspective on society. So while he was a congressman in Michigan, he ran a bill over 13 times. It was called the Runaway Pappy Bill. And his intention was to try to ensure that fathers couldn't leave one state in order to avoid paying child support. He was unsuccessful in getting the Runaway Pappy Bill signed into law while he was the congressman. But he worked for it over 25 years and literally tried authoring something over 13 separate times. So, politics happen. We all know a lot of the story. We're not going to spend a lot of time here, but he becomes president, right? So Gerald Ford becomes president. He becomes president, and he's like, now is my opportunity. I can make child support a real thing. So in 1975, he signs an amendment to the Social Security Act, which created the 4D program, so Chapter 4D of the Social Security Act, which created the child support program. The child support program was signed into law, like I said, in 1975, and it had two purposes at the time. So one, it addressed some of the things that mattered to him because of his own personal life. The RAND report had gotten a lot of attention at that time, and so it also influenced policy and politics at the time. And they were wanting to look for a solution to ensure mothers and children could support themselves and have the support of their fathers. But at the same time, I mentioned the AFDC in 1935. The cost of all of these social programs was getting quite high. There was a significant increase in public assistance costs. It actually increased, let's see here, from 1965 to 1976, over 400%. And 83% of all applications for AFDC were because of an absent parent. So one parent was gone, one parent had the children, 83%, and you had a 400% increase. So in 1975, when they created the child support program, they're like, well, okay, so should the taxpayer be responsible if one parent's going to leave and leave the other parent to raise the children? And at the time, the decision was made no. And so, as part of child support, they created a policy that the child support that is collected while the mother is on welfare pays the government back for all those welfare costs. So it was a cost recovery program. So child support in 1975 was kind of twofold. So generally speaking, white, affluent parents to address President Ford's own family upbringing and simultaneously to recover the costs of welfare because the costs of welfare were really skyrocketing. So it had this twofold mission in 1975. And it required mothers to cooperate with the program, and they had to assign their rights to all their child support and give it to the government. They were not allowed to have welfare and keep their child support. I'll talk more about what that's looked like over the last 50 years, and it's had a significant impact, I think, on families broadly. Okay, so here's a little bit of an additional timeline. So I mentioned at the beginning, we had 1935, we had AFDC, we also at the time had the flu epidemic, and et cetera. Then jump forward 1975, we have child support. Okay, so then in 1980, the same thoughts are continuing. They're like, all right, well, we've got foster care, we've got child welfare families. Should the taxpayer be responsible for those families? Even though they're getting foster care payments, it's like, no, child support. We're going to collect child support to pay back government for foster care families. So that happened in 1980, and they created in 1980, make the responsible parent responsible for the costs associated with foster care. So we opened up child support cases on all those foster care family cases, and collected child support from those parents after their child had been put in foster care. In 1984, again, the same sentiment around frustration around these increased costs for taxpayers. They're wanting to give the child support program additional enforcement tools. They want us to be able to collect more money to recover more costs because the costs are too high. And if you think about the 1980s, in the 1980s, there was a different level, a different kind of politic, and it was really around accountability and, again, recovering costs and decreasing the tax burden. So in 1984, they incorporated into this law a mandatory IWO, or income withholding order, so wage garnishment. So if somebody's employed, that means we can issue we're mandated to issue an income withholding order to take money from somebody's paycheck in order to pay their child support to recover these costs. Also gave us the authority to intercept people's taxes, both state and federal taxes, in order to pay their child support, to issue liens, real property liens against people's homes and other property that they may own, and also to report to credit. If somebody's delinquent in their child support, we report to credit. In 1988, again, the same sentiment is continuing, and so now it's not only we're mandated to issue an income withholding order, but we're mandated to issue it immediately. So as soon as we find employment, it had to happen right away. Also, it added timeframes for RNAs, which means a review and adjustment. So if somebody's circumstances have changed, now there's very specific timeframes when we have to review child support orders to make sure they're appropriate and that we're getting the most money possible, because we have to recover the costs of welfare, foster care, etc. It also requires a statewide system. So every state in the United States is required to have one single statewide system that all counties, all families have in that single system. In California, we were a little slow in getting our system, so it didn't actually implement here until 2008, but in 1988 is when the requirement started. So, okay, so again, just to kind of reiterate, so again, we had major poverty, we had response and the implementation of a welfare system, then we have this cost recovery system, and we're looking to offset the costs associated with these expanding welfare programs in the 60s and 70s. Some of you may remember in the 80s there was a stereotype of the welfare queen and a lot of kind of thoughts around whether there's fraud associated with welfare queens and that you have multiple cases, and there are a lot of negative stereotypes that were kind of manufactured and incorporated into some of the political rhetoric of the time. And it really changed people's perceptions of what welfare was, who was on welfare, why they were on welfare, and it really took it away from kind of, no, they're single parents, the other parent's gone, and it changed people's thoughts around why people are on welfare in a really pretty negative way. So fast forward to 1996, and you have welfare reform. So again, folks are concerned about the cost recovery, so that still stands. We still have all these enforcement tools to collect child support. But now we're going to make sure people can go back to work, that they're not on welfare for an extended period of time. So again, because the rhetoric and the perceptions in the 1980s changed, and then there was a lot of disagreement in the 80s and 90s around what's the right thing to do, and the generational welfare, all of those things. So in 1996, Bill Clinton signed the Personal Responsibility Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, sometimes referred to as PERWARA, and that is welfare reform. And in welfare reform, it's a block grant, so TANF, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, that replaces AFDC. TANF, there's block grants that are given to each state, so every state has the opportunity to kind of define and mold exactly how they're going to do service delivery as a result of PERWARA, welfare reform. It also incorporates a 5-year TANF, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, time limit. So meaning you can only be on welfare for 5 years, and then you have to get off. So every state handles that a little bit differently. In California, there's a lot of safety net programs that are built in, and I can elaborate on those more later if you're interested. But in the welfare reform, it was 5 years. It's like, we've had enough. We need to recover these costs. It can't be unlimited. It's going to be 5 years, and then you're on your own. You've got to get a job.
Is that 5 years total across your lifetime, or is that 5 years at a time?
5 years across your lifetime as an adult. So if you were a child, it would be different, but as an adult. And there's a literal tracking of every month on aid. So in California, there are some exemptions. So depending if you have an infant, or if you have a small child, or if you have specific medical issues, you can have an exemption, and those months wouldn't count towards your 60-month clock. But the intention is for it to be over your life. And it adds a work requirement. So as part of TANF, there's now a work requirement. So you can't just get welfare and not work. You can get welfare, but you're required to work. And if you can't work, then you've got to go into job training programs or education programs, or go in for job services. In California, I think they added some additional services, alcohol, drug, mental health treatment, and also incorporated additional support services, child care, transportation, ancillary, so if you need boots to go to work, or if you need special equipment kind of thing. So that was also one, and every state did not do that, California did. So again, you can see the evolution of this program. And again, the intention, I think, when President Ford signed it in, was in part to serve all families, but really the policies were crafted and the enforcement were crafted around the poor. And so when you really think about some of the enforcement that had been happening, I think some of the maybe unintended consequences is we have an enforcement against generally low-income men. And that has some consequences, and I think there's some questions when you think about universal justice. Is the scale weighted properly? All children deserve support of children, all children deserve the support of both parents, but we have to take into consideration the needs of both parents in making that determination. But you can see over time how the program has evolved. All right, so times continue to change. In 1998, there's a Child Support Performance Incentive Act, and so that's a time when the federal government said, states, you need to do better, and we're going to set specific measures, and we're going to measure everything you do to make sure you're meeting these 5 federal performance measures, and that includes parentage. So part of what child support does is determine parentage and does genetic testing to determine who dad is. The other performance measures around orders, the establishment of child support orders, and then how much we collect. How much we collect in child support in the month that it's due, and then how much we collect in the month that when it's arrears. So if someone hasn't paid, how much do we collect? And then what is our cost effectiveness? How much do we collect versus how much we cost to run as a program? So those are the 5 federal performance measures. Those were implemented in 1998 because there was a lot of scrutiny that states needed to collect more. In 1999, kind of dropping down there in that timeline there, in California, we had the California Child Support Reform of 1999. So prior to 1999, so from 1975 to 1999, in California, the DA's office ran the child support program. And so they get the DA's office, it's an enforcement arm, and had all these enforcement tools, and they were enforcing child support across each of the local DAs across the state. In 1999, they said, in California, this is limited to California, the legislature decided, we don't really want this to still be in the DA's office. We don't want this kind of stronger enforcement. We're going to move it out of the DA's office and create a standalone child support program. So that's what happened in 1999. So in California, and most of the rest of my presentations can be more California-centric, but we started really looking and saying, wow, we've got a lot of debt from low-income fathers, and some of our policies are pushing fathers away from the mothers and the children. And is that the right thing? Again, from kind of this more universal justice perspective, has what we've done over these last, at that time, 30 years or so, is that really what we're trying to achieve? And does that have unintended consequences? And the answer is yes. And so, yes, it has unintended consequences. Not yes, they might see what we wanted to achieve. So, California implemented a compromise of arrears program because there was a tremendous amount of debt that was owed. And there's a combination, some debt if the person was on public assistance, welfare, then it was owed to the government, as I talked about, but other debt was owed to the other parent. So if somebody had never been on welfare, then that money was owed to the other parent. So this compromise of arrears program was really focused on those folks who owed money to the government. So if you've owed money to the government, is that really are we still in a cost recovery place? Is that really what we want? So the COPE program gave an opportunity for parents, again, generally fathers, to compromise some of their debt and say, I can't pay, because sometimes some of this debt can get up to $100,000, $150,000, $200,000, depending on how many children and how much they were able to pay. It can be quite significant. And so the compromise of arrears program allowed you to make a lump sum payment and compromise the rest. One thing I didn't mention actually in the earlier slide, in California, we were required in 1992 to start charging interest. So in California, it's 10% interest. 10% interest.
It would have been a lot easier for the people the men who left, if they didn't have to pay income tax on the money they paid for support.
They didn't have to pay income tax.
Yes, I remember reading about 15 years ago that a good percentage of men who had left their families fell into debt primarily because they couldn't afford to pay the taxes on the money they were paying their former partner or child.
So from my perspective, generally what would happen is somebody would, you're employed, right? And you're paying taxes on your income, right? You're paying for those taxes. And then, as I was talking about earlier, we have our income withholding order. And then on top of that, we take the child support out of the paycheck, right? So in California, we have a rule where we can't take more than 50% of someone's income. But when you think about 50%, that's actually a lot. And so I think it's not so much that they could, because there's no tax on child support. But when you take your taxes out of your paycheck, you take your child support out of your paycheck, you take your daily living out of your paycheck, not much left, depending on how much you're making. And it did create issues. It absolutely creates a host of issues. So the compromise of arrears program was attempting to kind of alleviate some of that and sort of write off some of that interest and to write off some of that old debt that's owed to the government. Again, not to the other parent, but the money that was owed to the government. In 2005, there was the Deficit Reduction Act, and one of the really important parts of the Deficit Reduction Act of 2005 was it incentivized, this was a federal law, it incentivized states to pass more money to families as opposed to keeping it for cost recovery. Okay? Now in California, although that was passed in 2005, we didn't implement 2020. So we implemented it in 2020, and we implemented it during the COVID pandemic. And so, never waste a good crisis. So I think it was a good opportunity in California to say, families need more money. This is really hard times. So we're going to shift some of this. Instead of being cost recovery for the state, we're going to shift it so we're able to send more money to families. And I think that was a good choice in 2020. In 2021, they had an opportunity to kind of modify the compromise of arrears program, and they made it easier. And they also took into consideration more regional differences. If you're living in Marin County and you owe child support, that's very different than if you live in Yolo County, right? So your cost of living is going to be different there. How much you're making is probably different there. And so that's one of the things they incorporated in the debt reduction is what is the regional expectation of income and what are the regional costs of living. And so that was factored into this calculation so we could actually kind of write off more debt across the state that really helped people kind of unload some of these arrears.
I don't know much about any of this, but was the amount that, let's say, an absent father required to pay, was that determined by a court decision, or are there statutes for that, or?
Yes.
More or less.
So, good question. A child support order is based on what's called a guideline amount. And there's a specific kind of mathematical equation that's in statute in California that really factors in how much somebody makes and how much custody and visitation are the two main kind of components that inform the guideline. So that guideline is then essentially documented into a child support order that is signed by the judge. And so it is a legal court order, and the legal court order is a guideline amount. So earlier when I talked about review and adjustment, or RNA on that earlier slide, so if someone's job changes, let's say they lose their job, then you could go through and you would do a new guideline amount based on no income or less income, depending on your circumstances, or possibly more income if you got a promotion. And then you would get a new child support order that would go before the court, get signed by the judge, and you proceed. Yeah.
Would a father have to pay for this legal activity? I mean, with the appeals and all of that? Because that would be a deterrent to them.
Yeah. So if you open up a 4D child support case, so if you go to the vet, you're not required to, but if you open up a case, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes, but our office has attorneys. Our office has child support staff who are expert in all of these details, and the most that gets charged is $35 a year to the parent receiving support. And that's only if we collect more than $500. So it's essentially free. You could choose not to go through our services and pay for an attorney and pay the process to go to the court to get your court order modified or established, either way. And some people choose that. I think one of the reasons why I think these kind of conversations are so important is a lot of people don't know our services exist. And so they don't know that they can come and apply. I think anyone can apply, and it's $35 a year. And again, we have attorneys and staff who do accounting, and I can elaborate on that. But so it's a choice. You can pay for, and you can also try and do it yourself. And so there are some people who use the self-help center at the court to try and do it themselves, and can be successful. It is complicated though, and that can be challenging. All right, so more, yeah.
Well, I have another question off of his, is do you provide legal services to both the recipient and the payer, or just the recipient?
Both.
Both.
Both parents. And either parent can apply for services. And one of the things that we're seeing more of is, well, two things. One is more father-headed single parent households, that's one thing. And then another is with more shared 50-50 custody, and with women starting to kind of making more money. We actually see, even with 50-50 shared custody, where women are paying fathers child support. And we're seeing, because we have really extensive detailed accounting records and all of the accounting staff, a lot of times families, even paying parents, will open up a case because they don't want to deal with the drama of arguing. I paid you last month. I know I did. I have the receipt said, no, no, we have it all, it's all documented, and we can have reports that we can provide to the court so that you don't have to fight with one another about the money, and hopefully work together to co-parent your kids. And so there are more and more parents that are applying for services for those reasons, even the paying parent, because he just kind of gets away from that drama. Yeah.
This may be getting too far in the weeds. I know you mentioned it earlier about paternity tests.
Yes.
So is someone who is the absent father, does that require that they have been married, or simply that someone be the biological parent, or how do you determine what father means?
Yes. So there is a legal definition of parentage and whether parentage is even at issue. So if the child was born in the confines of a marriage, then the father, the husband, is the father of the child. If the child is born outside of wedlock, then there's a process where we can do the genetic testing to determine who the father is. There are also a number, especially, well, today, more and more couples are having children outside of marriage by design, by choice, and they're doing so intentionally, and so there's a process, it's called a voluntary declaration of parentage, where the father and the mother can sign at the hospital saying, yes, I am the father, and then now it's legal parentage. So you can do that in the hospital if you want, and it doesn't have to be in the hospital, it can be afterwards elsewhere too. But you can do a voluntary declaration of parentage. A child can be born inside the marriage, or we can do genetic testing to determine who the father is. And the genetic testing is at no cost, and we'll do genetic testing as many times as needed until we find the father.
How much organization fund?
Our organization is funded with state and federal funds. So 1/3 state funding, 2/3 federal funding.
And do you expect a reduction in federal funding under the new budget?
In the new budget, well, are you saying, talking about this with the shutdown?
No, not the shutdown, but the budget for this year.
No, our allocation is the same. So one of the things I think that's really interesting about the child support program is generally, and to not get into a partisan discussion, but it's appreciated by both parties, generally speaking. Democrats generally like the program because it reduces poverty and it's helping families. Republicans generally like the program because there's a level of accountability and there is a level of cost recovery. So generally speaking, our program doesn't get in the crosshairs in political fights around service delivery. And I think too, because and I'll talk more about some of the numbers, but because we do collect a lot of money for a lot of poor children, it is a huge benefit to local communities, states, and nationally. All right. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but if you guys have any questions, feel free to slow me down. These are some of the legislative changes that have happened in California. So I mentioned that foster care. So we were required to open child support cases for foster care. So in 2023, a bill was passed and said, parents are having a tough time. Their kid was just taken away. There are other issues happening in that household, right? It could be mental health, it could be substance abuse, it could be just deep poverty, it could be a whole host of things. And now child support's going after the parents to pay money, or maybe trying to kind of get their lives in order so they can get their kid back. So is that really the best thing to be doing? And this bill, and which became law, said no, it's not. It's not in the best interest of children to have parents pay for child support that recovers costs for foster care. Let them focus on getting their lives in order and hopefully getting their kids back and being good parents and not having their child in the system. So that law changed. So as a result, we've closed down our foster care cases and we've written off all that debt that was owed on those cases because it was all owed to the government. It wasn't owed to another parent. So that just happened recently and I think that was a really good thing. The next one, AB 1148, that also happened. That happened in 2024, and it used to be that when someone was incarcerated back in the day, their child support kept ticking. So if you owe $500 a month and you're incarcerated for 5 years, you don't have the ability to earn, so it just continues to tick along. And so there was a change in the family code in California that said, yeah, that's not such a great idea. That doesn't, they don't have the ability to pay. Even if they're in a work program while they're incarcerated, they're not making regular money. And so this particular bill says, okay, don't add child support while they're incarcerated, and allow them 10 months after incarceration to get back on their feet, to get a job, to get an apartment, before you start doing child support again. Yeah.
Is child support exempted from personal bankruptcy?
It is not. So, well, let me restate that. You cannot discharge child support in a bankruptcy proceeding.
Just like student loans.
Well, I believe student loans you can discharge. No, okay. But child support you cannot. Formally assisted pass-through. So earlier, remember I was talking about the Debt Reduction Act and that it was incentivizing states to give more money to families. So this is connected to that, and it's saying, okay, so for those folks who used to be on welfare, aren't now, but used to, and there's arrears owed on your case, so old child support debt, somebody's paying it, maybe a small amount every month, we're now going to give that to you, the other parent. We're not going to keep that as child support. So that implemented in May of 2024 and has resulted statewide in millions of dollars going directly to the other parent and not as cost recovery to the government. What they haven't yet implemented in California is what's called current assistance pass-through. So for people who are on welfare now, they are still required to assign their rights and give up any child support. And that money is collected and goes back to repay the costs of CalWORKs, for example. But it was a huge step, I think, in the right direction. The cost of foregoing the child support for currently assisted would be astronomical, in part because it gets complicated, but it would be very, very high, and I can explain that if you're interested. And so the California legislature has not implemented that piece at this time. Maybe in a few years. Phase one, I'll talk about that a little bit more, but essentially that is a new law. It was actually a federal rule that was approved actually quite a few years ago. In California, SB 343 was passed, and it's an effort to really right-size orders. So back in the day, when it was a heavy-handed enforcement program, it was the highest order possible. Now it's like, okay, let's really evaluate this more. Let's maybe consider a low-income adjustment and reevaluate what that low-income adjustment is if the paying parent is low-income. So it factors in a number of things, and I'll get into some more detail on that in a minute.
What does that stand for?
Let's see here, Flexibility and Efficiency Modernization Act.
Test question.
All right, SB 1055. So one of the enforcement tools that I didn't mention earlier is license revocation. So if you don't pay your child support, we'll take licenses. And it's not just driver's licenses, but part of one of the consequences of not paying your child support can be any license.
Profession?
Any profession. So it could be if you're a lawyer, it could be if you're a doctor, it could be if you're a barber, it could be if you're a guard. It's all of them. And your driver's license. Yep, if you're licensed, right? So, because again, fundamentally, child support supports children. Yeah.
Teacher license?
You're credentialed, you're not licensed, so no. Yeah. So there was a law change that was established from SB 1055, and what that says is essentially you can no longer suspend somebody's driver's license if they're low income. And they define low income as under 70% of median household income for the county in which they reside. So that law change happened recently. It's been challenging in some regards because everyone wants their driver's license. And if we suspended a license, it would often cause somebody to call us, and then we could negotiate a payment plan and get them kind of back on track. And so it wasn't really about necessarily keeping their license. But it was a way to get folks' attention, to say, no, child support matters, you got to pay your child support, this is important. But this did change it so that if you're low income, we no longer suspend licenses.
So I'm not sure about something, the amount of money that is attempted to be recovered by the government. What's the relationship between that and the amount of money that the child gets? In other words, is the amount of money that the parent or the child gets, the victim, let's say in this case, dependent upon the payment of the person that flew the coop, the father? In other words, it seems to me that what would be best or fair is to have, since children are citizens, they should be taken care of by collectively. They should get, somehow, some formula where they get a certain amount that's going to ensure that they're raised properly and not deprived. And then it's between the government and these, let's say, absent fathers to get money, so to put pressure on them to pay back. I can understand why you might have these kind of punitive measures, but that's between the government and them, right? It has nothing to do really with the parents. I mean, do you see what I'm getting at? What's the connection between the father who flies the coop and the children that they left behind?
So,
Am I making sense?
I think, so let me start, and I'll say some things and you can redirect me if I'm not quite getting to where you're going. So, the child support that is collected, actually, let's set aside those folks who receive public assistance, that receive welfare, so set that aside for a second. If you have never received welfare and are not now, if we collect money from the absent father, let's say, and we send it to the custodial mother, the expectation is that she's using that to raise the kids, and that would be paying rent, buying food, school supplies, all the things. Whether the father has a relationship with those children is a separate matter, and the family law court will manage the custody and visitation.
Yeah, so I'm not, let me redirect you. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, I don't know how to put this, but
I'll answer your question.
Okay.
If you make $1 million a year, you're going to give more child support if you're making $50,000.
That's true.
But does the,
but what I'm saying is, it seems to me like there's some money that is being, let's say, independent of welfare. Right? We're talking about the amount that the mother, I guess, needs in order to raise the child. So is it like if a mother's living in Marin County and she's used to living in a $10 million house and she expects a certain amount of money to raise her kid in that circumstance, is that something that is factored into how much then the father would have to pay? Or is there a set amount of money that goes to a mother that needs to raise a certain amount of money, minimum that she needs to raise her child, independent of that? Am I making any sense?
I think so. The guideline amount that I talked about earlier, the equation that determines how much child support is set in the child support order is based on how much the obligated parent, the paying parent, earns, and how much their custody and visitation with the child. So it's both of those things. And we take a look at some additional, there's tax information that we look at and some other kind of components, but fundamentally it's income and visitation, right? So those are the two things. So if one parent's making $1 million a year, they are going to pay significantly more than somebody who makes $50,000 a year, because that guideline is using the income. And that income is not just earned income. It can be rental income, it can be investment income, it can be a lot of different income is broadly determined. And so that child support amount, that guideline amount, is based on income. And then all that payment, that child support payment goes to the parent that has the children for the care and custody of their child. That help? That answer?
Yeah, okay, I have some other questions.
Okay, well, I'll keep going and then you
Okay,
can
great, yeah.
cover it. I think you had a question as well? No. Okay. All right. So, then phase 1 was a change to our guideline. I was just talking about that. Then phase 2 is right-sizing the orders. So that's 2 phases. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about what phase 2 is. And then uncollectible debt. This is a new, we used some of the authority, policy-making authority in 81 and 35 to essentially dismiss all that foster care debt I talked about a little bit ago. But it also says if you have, if your only income is, for example, Social Security SSI, then if that's your sole source of income, then you don't have to pay your child support, and and we'll dismiss if it's owed to the government. We'll dismiss that. Essentially, we'll stop enforcing and collecting on child support. And so there's several different income types. If that's your sole source of income, then you don't have to pay child support. But these are folks that have very limited income, and so their ability to support themselves and pay their child support, that's again, cost recovery, is determined not to be good policy in California.
I have a question I really don't expect you to answer. You might know. I certainly don't know. These people who are the absentee fathers, they owe $100, let's say. And that's now debt. It's debt to the state of California, because the state of California is providing benefits to the child and the child's mother, let's say. So when the state of California forgives that debt, does it take on the $100 worth of debt under the state's budget?
I do know the answer to that. So if you think about, again, just using these simple numbers, $100 of welfare was already expended, so it's already been paid. This is saying to the obligated parent, you don't owe that $100 anymore. So the money's already been spent, and so it's not scored on the state's budget as a new kind of deficit. It's just written off. So it doesn't.
It's just not collected.
It's just not collected. The welfare's already been paid. It's out.
So it doesn't increase the debt, it just lowers the income level of the safe.
Right, exactly.
Got it.
It reduces revenue. Yeah. Did you have a question?
No.
All right. The other thing that uncollectible debt is going to do in phase 2, and we haven't implemented yet in California, is there are a number of parents who have had open cases. Child support case will stay open until the parent either pays it, generally speaking, or until they pass away. So you can pay during Social Security, you can pay through probate. So cases will stay open 30, 40 plus years. So there are some folks who owe a tremendous amount of debt, who haven't paid in years, who have no ability to pay. Perhaps they're homeless, perhaps they've been incarcerated, perhaps, there's a whole host of reasons. And so part of what this is doing is it's creating an algorithm for us to identify the high-risk cases, kind of like you think about the credit agency. Like, these folks are never going to be able to pay this money. And so it's going to give California an opportunity to, again, for money that's owed to the government, to discharge that debt. Because it's not going to pay any risk. Yeah.
If someone's in jail, well, then they're not going to pay the debt, obviously. At what point does the criminal justice system contact your department to keep track? So does the person who comes out of jail have to go through the paperwork of saying, hey, I've been in jail for 5 years, I should know you before this month?
So both things happen. So we have, our child support system has interfaces with jails, state prisons, federal prisons, other institutions. And so we do get in and through the interface a notification that John Doe is now in prison and he's at San and then we'll get the projected release date. So if he was convicted of murder and he's going to be in custody for 25, 30 years, we'll close the case. If they, have a shorter term, 3 years, breaking and entry, we'll keep the case open. Now, we'll stop the accrual each month, but the debt will wait. And then once they're out, we'll work to collect it. All right, so I talked about BEM phase 2. So an important part of phase 2, again, if you're thinking about the policy shift over time, is to really look at somebody's ability to pay. And so we're now going to be required, starting January 2026, to contemplate 14 factors. If we don't know, when we're establishing a child support order, if we don't know what their income is, let's say we can't find any income, the other parent doesn't know, the person's not responding to us, we have to use these 14 factors to determine that will influence that child support order. So instead of just using a pure guideline amount, so if we find out, for example, this person has been, has a criminal record, maybe has no English literacy, perhaps has very little job skills, then that will influence their earning capacity. And so that will then influence their child support order. So their order will be lower because they have other issues that are affecting their ability to work full-time and earn income. And that amount will be established by the courts. We'll give information to the courts about this information, about these factors, and the court will make the ultimate decision. But this will start in January 2026, again, with the goal to consider what is the paying parent's ability to pay, what is their earning capacity. Let's get right size orders so that it's fair for all parents and the children still get supported.
Question. I mean, I don't know, I was just trying to think of like different examples. So farm workers who are undocumented, does they fit into this system, or how do you have to have social security number? Like how?
Yes. So what's I think fascinating about this program, it is a global program. So the 4D program is a national program, as I talked about. But there is a treaty that was signed at The Hague, and in the Hague Treaty, it defines all the countries that have a reciprocity and that will collect child support through other countries. So our case, so you do not have to have citizenship. And so we have cases where maybe the obligated parents in Ukraine, maybe they're in England, maybe they're in Canada, maybe they're in Mexico, all over the world. And so some countries, like Mexico as an example, may have less kind of government infrastructure, and so it's harder to cooperate versus if it was England or Canada or something like that.
Is that cooperation with Israel? Because I know Israel will not extradite people for financial harm.
No, I actually don't know. I don't know. Yeah.
It's universal justice.
I think it is.
Yeah,
I do. I think this is a fitting topic, and I think what's really cool about this topic, I love this stuff, but I think what's cool about this topic is it really shows how government, which can be slow, but can really look at, we have policy, it has unintended consequences, that has an inequitable treatment of families, and we can do better, so we are going to do better. And they change laws and they change policies. And because really, I think everyone can agree, children need support, and ideally from both parents. And so there are sometimes circumstances where both parents can't support their children. There's a host of them. But basically, children deserve the support of both parents. And so, but let's create a system that doesn't harm either parent in that process. And let's engage both parents. I think to your question earlier, do we serve both parents? Yes. So back in the day, when it was a stronger enforcement program, I think some would say, no, you weren't really serving fathers. You were finding and soliciting and getting payment from fathers. But the program has evolved such that we absolutely serve both parents, and we have services for both parents. And this is about kids. This is about making sure kids are supported. And kids know who their dad is. There's so much research that really shows, I mean, for medical reasons and health reasons, you should know who your father is. For having extended family, you should know who your father is. For knowing your father and having a relationship, you should know who your father is, right? There's some really fundamental reasons why you need to know who dad is, separate from the financial aspect of this. And as I mentioned, we're seeing more and more father-headed households where fathers are taking care of their children and mothers are doing, either they're working or they're not raising their children. And so you're seeing more of that. So anyway, so these are the 14 factors that we're going to be considering as part of earning capacity. And these are some of our goals as part of them. Again, that's starting next year, improving, kind of setting more accurate obligations. And if it's a right-sized order, right? If it's a payable order, people generally want to support their kids. When it's too high and they can't afford it is when they run from it. But when it's an affordable payable amount, generally speaking, they'll pay, and they want to pay because it's their kid, and they want their kid to do well, right? So it increases on-time payments because the person can pay, and they want to pay, and now it's an amount that is doable. It can also move non-paying cases to paying status. So I talked earlier about review and adjustment. So we modify our orders. So if we had an old order that was too high, we can use this new approach to really make sure we have right-sized orders. Improve collection rates, reduce child support arrearages, and it also allows us to incorporate some more technology into our system so that we can make it easier for parents.
During this flexible analysis, there's got to be sometimes where there's disagreement between the two parents.
Absolutely.
How do you resolve that? Do you do an arbitration system? Does it go back to the courts?
So our staff will work with parents to see if they can help negotiate an agreement. Sometimes we're not able to do that. So then it goes before the court, and the court does it. And so the other thing that we take into consideration is that some of the families, there's family violence. And so we're very intentional about ensuring that if family violence is present in this family's life, that then we're generally not going to be trying to negotiate, and we'll leave it to the court. All right, so that was a big picture journey of the history of child support. I'm going to tell you a little bit about us, and I'm going to go, and I've touched on a few of these things. So we started as a regional agency in January of 2021. That's when we became one agency. Prior to that, we were 3 separate county departments, Colusa, Sutter, and Yolo. And in 2021, we came together as one agency. I mentioned earlier, we're state and federal funded. So it made sense to us. We could be more efficient with our same state and federal allocation if we were one agency. We don't need 3 directors. We don't need 3 budget officers. We don't need 3 training coordinators, right? We could be one and just happen to have 3 offices so that our families can get to us and have access services and be more efficient and be a good steward of government dollars. So it's been great, and we really did a literal county merger, which if you have experience with government, you can imagine it was challenging. So we had, all 3 counties are unionized, all 3 counties have their own policies and rules, all 3 counties have their own IT systems, all of the things. And so we have regionalized. And so we started that in January 2021, and we are fully regionalized. And so all of our staff have cases from all 3 jurisdictions. We have about 9,500 cases across the 3 counties, and we collect about $22 million every year. And if you figure these 3 counties are relatively small counties and have some deep pockets of poverty in each of those 3 counties, and so $22 million, that's a lot. And when you fit, most of that is now going directly to families. And so when you think, that is literally Cheerios and sneakers and back to school supplies and all of those things. And so it makes a real difference to local economies, and it makes a real difference to local families. And so I think it's important to understand how many families, so 9,500 cases. Most of them are YOLO. YOLO is the largest of the 3. Yeah, so that's who we are. That's our logo, who we serve. We touched on, yes.
Do you have a sense whether the non-custodial parent is typically within the same county or in a different location?
It varies. A lot of the obligated parents, we live in other counties. And when you think too, in these 3 counties, generally people go where the jobs are. Right? And so many people go to Sacramento, and then like Sutter, a lot of people, Yuba Sutter, they cross back and forth a lot. And then West Sacramento in particular, West Sacramento, Sacramento. So it varies, but then as I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of international cases and we have a lot of interstate cases. Yeah.
This is going to sound ridiculous, but do you know how you selected the 3 colors to represent?
It does not sound ridiculous. It was very intentional how we did it. So we looked at the county seals of each of the 3 counties. So Colusa, gold Rush Colusa. So we pulled gold. Orange, and the Sutter County seal, there's peaches. So we pull the orange from the peach and the seal, and in the YOLO County seal, there's a river. And so it's the blue. So we were very intentional, and if you go to our website, I do have some brochures, and our link is there too, but it's CalusaCenterYOLOChildSupport.org, or .gov now. You can see we've used those colors as part of our branding in all of what we do. So I touched on this a little bit earlier, but we serve anyone who's co-parenting. So regardless of income, you could be poor, you could be wealthy. You can be an NBA star, you could be a politician, you could be homeless, you could be a migrant worker. It does not matter. Income does not matter. Citizenship does not matter. Custody does not matter. As I mentioned earlier, a paying parent can apply for services, a receiving parent can apply for services. We have actually changed, just on that point, our language. It used to be custodial parent, CP, and NCP, non-custodial parent. But families have changed, and it's not that binary, right? It's shared custody. Most families have shared custody, and it's really insulting to say you're a non-custodial parent when you actually have custody of your kids. And so we're now changing our language to be parent receiving support and parent paying support. That's, yeah.
What is your policy if you're contacted by ICE for citizenship of the people in your system?
So our system, our records are highly confidential, and as defined in the Family Code in California, Family Code 17212, we are not allowed to release our records to anyone. And if ICE were to come on premise, we have the same policies that we do for any county department. They can access public spaces, but none of our secure space and none of our private space. So it doesn't matter whether legal parentage has been established. We talked about that earlier. So if you don't know who dad is, we'll do that part for you through the genetic testing process that we talked about.
The court order genetic testing then, if you're like, okay, we thought it was this guy, but now we need to test this guy.
So
And the court
actually does not need to order it. So they can. So if mom comes in and says, I think it's this guy, then we'll do genetic testing, and it's not, then well, maybe it's this guy. So then we'll do genetic testing. Now, if there's not interest in participating, then we can get a court order to do genetic testing. But most of the time, folks will do it. We use the LabCorp is our genetic testing contract, and so all of California uses LabCorp, and there's very specific processes. So we do the genetic testing right on site, and we're located in Woodland at the corner of Port and West of California.
Do they keep the genetic information?
LabCorp,
Yeah. Because you know there's this case now where
23andMe, and all that.
they're selling the company, and the question is what's happening to all that data?
So I do not believe they keep that, but I don't know that 100% because it's a state contract, and so I have not personally read the contract, but I don't believe so. All right, and it doesn't matter. So you can have a pre-existing order. So maybe you got a divorce, and through that dissolution, you got a child support order. That's fine. We'll enforce it. Or maybe you had a child outside of wedlock. You don't have a divorce. You don't have a custody arrangement. Nothing. You can come through us, and we'll establish a child support order. The other thing that we'll do is we establish health insurance orders so that the parent who's paying support can provide health insurance for the children. Okay, so very quickly, I've touched on most of this. So we do genetic testing, we establish parentage, we establish and enforce orders for child support and health insurance. We collect the money. I talked about income withholding orders. Over 70% of all child support paid is paid directly through an income withholding order. It's a very normal thing. It's easiest for everyone because you don't have to write a check, you don't have to make a payment, it just happens. And then we distribute it, so we keep track of all of the address and all those things. We do the accounting, as I mentioned. We also will locate parents and assets. So if a parent if the other parent doesn't know where they are, we'll do locate. We have access to a lot of information. We can also locate their assets if they have vehicles, if they have cars, vehicles or homes or income, 1099 income. So if they're doing Uber or Lyft or DoorDash or any of those things, we have access to all that. We also will intercept their taxes, and we can use that, credit reports. There's a lot of different tools we have to locate parents and assets. So why child support matters. So I've talked a lot about the evolution of the program, and I'll link it back a little bit to universal justice, but child support promotes family stability. Children do better when they have the support of both kids. There's a lot of research that shows that if children have the support of both parents, they end up not being involved in criminal justice, they end up not becoming teen parents, they end up having better academic outcomes. And so if they can have the support of both parents, it creates family stability. It helps ensure children's needs are met, reduces poverty and inequities. As I mentioned, we've got over 22 million in just these 3 counties alone, and strengthens communities. If kids are doing better, families are doing better, communities are doing better.
What does the last piece say?
Strengthens communities. Sorry, that color didn't go well. Sorry about that. So just to give you some, this is a national infographic for 2024. Just to give you a sense, I mentioned it's a national program. So in 2024, child support program, the 4D program, collected almost $30 billion in child support alone in 1 year for over 12.2 million kids. So in California, just to give you some perspective, in California we collected $2.58 billion in California alone for about 900,000 children. So it's a huge program that has massive impacts for families, and I think most people don't really understand the size and scope and impact both in community, in the state, in the nation, and again, it even has global impact. So, equity in action, universal justice, reducing racial and economic disparities, creating realistic and sustainable obligations, empowering parents to support children. Those are the things that we've been focused on in California as it pertains to the child support program, with the goal of trying to achieve universal justice. One of the things, and I didn't talk a lot about it as the first box there, reducing racial disparities. One of the things that we have done is really started, and the state has actually done this, is taking a look at what are the racial disparities as to who owes debt and what are the enforcement actions, and really taking a look. So for example, in the foster care caseload, what was the racial impact of the prior policies, and when we were relieving the significant debt, what that was doing from, again, a policy perspective and from an equity perspective. And that was a really important part of a number of those legislative actions I talked about earlier, was the racial justice piece. Program modernization. So yes, we're a government, but I think we're far more modernized than many other government programs. We do have offices in each of our 3 counties, but there's very little you actually need to come see us for. So we've used DocuSign, so we can do almost all the legal documents virtually. So if you're working and you don't have time to come in, you don't have to come in. We'll send you a DocuSign. We will do all the communication by texting, and most young parents prefer that, as opposed to especially talking on the phone or coming into the office. We do have virtual booths, so our staff do a combination of telework and working in the office, and as I mentioned, our caseload is totally mixed. So you could have a caseworker in the city, but walk into our Brooklyn office and you can still have a face-to-face using our virtual booth with your case manager, so you don't have to tell your story again to a backup worker or somebody else. So those virtual booths is really helpful, especially for those folks who still do like to come into the office. Digital payment options, lots of different ways to pay your child support. It's not just cash and check, so there's kiosks in our lobbies. You can pay by credit card, you can pay by e-check, you can pay by essentially Western Union, you can go, I mean, it's PayPal, it's all of the different ways, credit card. So pretty much think of a way you can pay your child support using it. And then there's electronic payment cards, so if you're not banked, you could get your child support on a card, kind of like an EBT card if you're familiar with that, for like CalFresh. So you get a card that money loads onto, and then you can use that to spend for your regular costs of just living.
I work in the state government, yes, you are further ahead than any portions.
Yes. I'm thrilled at how much we've advanced in California over the last years. It's so much more efficient. It's fabulous.
If a couple get divorced and then remarry, is it automatic that this stuff goes away, or they have to apply to?
They remarry to each other.
Yes.
So if they remarry to each other and they never had welfare, then the child, they can essentially cancel the child support order. We can, they don't, it's no longer enforced because it's an intact family, right?
Is it automatic?
They need to report to us, both parents need to tell us that they're back together, and we do need to make sure, both parents, and not just one parent is telling us we're back together. And let's say they break up again, right? Which often happens, and not just married parents, but they're together, they break up, they're together, they break up, right? I mean, that's part of the past. So a lot of our cases open, close, because couples break up. All right, so I think there are continued reform opportunities, and I think there's some good things that we can do. I mentioned the current assistance pass-through. Hopefully that can happen at some point in time. I think we actually have a bill that's on the governor's desk right now that can help us get access to probate. So if somebody dies and owes child support and they have assets, then it gives us, they're required, the attorney or the representative is required to notify us so that we can make sure that money goes to pay their child support. So I think there's a lot of opportunities, stronger collaborations within communities, so more events like this to really share what we do and how we do it, and ongoing commitment to universal justice. So that's my presentation, and this is just a summary. I think I've touched on that.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. That was a wonderful presentation. There were a lot of questions during the presentation, but are there any other questions?
So do you guys have a sister office in Sacramento County and they provide the exact same services?
We do. Every single county in California has an office. They're called local child support agencies. In California, in Sacramento, it's on Powering Road, where their justice center is with the courts. So it's right across in the same little justice center, 3701 Powering Road.
Are there any other regional organizations like yours or you combine for counties?
There are 7. So it's Siskiyou, Modoc, Inyo, Mono, Sierra Nevada, Alpine, Calaveras, Tuolumne, and Amarillo, us, Santa Cruz, San Benito. I like to forget something.
She's got it.
Yeah, I don't believe it.
With some of the changes that are like, the suspension of payment during incarceration and for a period of time after, it's probably too new to have data on the outcomes of that, but is there going to be a way to put metrics on, to show the success of that somehow?
So really good question and timely question. So in the statutory framework that AB 1148, it included analysis. And so the department is required to submit supplemental reporting language to the legislature to tell them how it's going. And they're literally running that now, and I got an update on it today. So it should go back to the legislature in a couple months. And that's part of their analysis is how is this working? Is 10 months the right number? And what do the parents think? Because some of the receiving parents are really not happy about it, right? Because they're like, hey, I'm on my own, and I'm low income too, and he got locked up, but I still gotta raise our kids. This is really rough. And so some of the receiving parents aren't really happy about it, but part of their analysis is to reach out to parents. And so they've been talking to parents and getting information, and that will inform this legislative report to see is this actually working.
Would you committed to share with us your additional analysis?
So it's state's analysis. So I don't have
Public
it.
access.
They do. But I can tell you, it is, just from a kind of program local operational perspective, it is mixed. And so some parents, maybe they were in for a short period of time, and their job is still helpful for them. So they get out month 1, and they can still have their old job back. Some parents, right? That's not the normal, but some parents. Other parents, 10 months isn't even close enough, right? It took them, they were in for a long time, and it's going to take them, they got some barriers they got to move through, and it may take them longer than 10 months. So, and again, the parent receiving support has some opinions about this too, and so that factors in. So it's a complex situation, and I think does need more kind of data-driven analysis.
All right, so I do want to thank you all for coming out. We do have another speaker lined up. In February 10th, we're going to have the Yolo County Public Defender. So far, it's going to be Yolo County employees, I guess.
So the money's already been spent, and so it's not scored on the state's budget as a new kind of deficit. It's just written off. So it doesn't.
It's just not collected.
It's just not collected. The welfare's already been paid. It's out.
So it doesn't increase the debt, it just lowers the income level of the state.
Right, exactly.
Got it.
It reduces revenue. Yeah. Did you have a question?
No.
All right. The other thing that uncollectible debt is going to do in phase 2, and we haven't implemented yet in California, is there are a number of parents who have had open cases. Child support case will stay open until the parent either pays it, generally speaking, or until they pass away. So you can pay during Social Security, you can pay through probate. So cases will stay open 30, 40 plus years. So there are some folks who owe a tremendous amount of debt, who haven't paid in years, who have no ability to pay. Perhaps they're homeless, perhaps they've been incarcerated, perhaps, there's a whole host of reasons. And so part of what this is doing is it's creating an algorithm for us to identify the high-risk cases, kind of like you think about the credit agency. Like, these folks are never going to be able to pay this money. And so it's going to give California an opportunity to, again, for money that's owed to the government, to discharge that debt. Because it's not going to pay benefits. Yeah.
If someone's in jail,
Mm-hmm.
well, then they're not going to pay the debt, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
At what point does the criminal justice system contact your department to keep track of how? Well, there's a person who comes out of jail,